Can stronger Africa-China cooperation truly empower the Global South? The 9th Forum on China-Africa Cooperation has kicked off with a focus on modernization. But questions persist over the balance of power between Beijing and the 53 African states in attendance. Will increasing business and trade trickle down to African populations or increase inequality? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Africa-China cooperation. There was a time when it seemed like China was completely dependent on U.S. consumers to keep its economic engine running. But since Washington started imposing more tariffs on Chinese products, Beijing has been assertively looking elsewhere for new markets, and it's found some fertile ground in Africa. Now, China had been accused of exploiting the continent through mineral extraction and heavy export-based trade. But at this week's FOCAC forum, China is out to prove that empowering the Global South is the goal. Here's a look.
From railways in Kenya to manufacturing in Egypt and a port in Cameroon, evidence of Chinese investment in Africa is all around the continent. China is Africa's largest trading partner. Tang Xiaoyang, a professor at Tsinghua University, says it's a mutually beneficial relationship.
How they really situate their cooperation principles into this global south idea of like our vision of new world. That will be maybe the most important part of this FOCAC.
China says bilateral trade surpassed $282 billion last year. But the value of African imports from China far outstripped the value of exports to China, pointing to a trade imbalance. China is investing heavily in Africa to secure raw materials that help grow its economy.
Exporting raw material and relying on raw material so much is actually quite dangerous because the prices can change. These are commodities whose price is set on the international market. So for African countries, really, just extracting and then selling raw materials is not a good economic development strategy, and they should aim to diversify.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has reportedly raised the trade deficit issue with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Ramaphosa is one of 50 African leaders attending a China-Africa summit in Beijing. This is the 9th such forum, and it's likely to address China's role as a major lender to Africa, where many countries struggle with debt burdens. Xi may be looking to his guests to purchase more goods, such as electric vehicles, which will be subject to tariffs by the EU, the US and Canada.
China now leads in many aspects, like in new and emerging technologies, and like so cars, batteries for cars, solar panels, and so on and so forth. And Africa is a continent that is energy hungry. African countries lack leverage against China. Some people like to think, we can use the US to balance China. No, you cannot.
China and Africa both have 1.4 billion people, but China's economy is the second largest in the world, accounting for nearly 20% of global output. Africa, by contrast, is a continent of 54 countries whose combined economies are worth 3% of the world's output. And that sets the stage for a complex relationship.
A complex relationship indeed that some say is in dire need of greater equality. But is that possible to achieve? Well, joining me now to look further at Sino-African relations and the forum now underway are from Beijing, political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen, from London, African affairs analyst Adetunji Omotola, and also from London, CEO of Rich Management and an emerging economy specialist, Aly-Khan Satchu. Thanks all so much for being with me. Einar, let's start with what's happening right now and how important a forum like FOCAC is. China's investment in Africa absolutely dwarfs other investors. You've got every country really except Eswatini, if I'm not mistaken, represented right now in Beijing. So what can we expect as far as outcomes are concerned here?
Well, let's put it in context. FOCAC, as it's called, started in 2000, so that's before China joins the WTO. So this is a sign that China was interested in Africa long before it had its meteoric growth. And the relationship goes on a long time. It was Africa that supported China at the UN, and it was China that supported a lot of African countries in their struggle to be free. So fast forward to today, the Belt and Road Initiative is healthy. You not only saw them gathering here at this every 3-year meeting, but also there are 154 countries, including most of these, represented at the Belt and Road Initiative. So at this point, the relationships are very good. They're based on economics. They do not have all of the kind of political baggage that goes along with anything that comes from the World Bank, the United States, or any other of the development banks.
So tell me this reputation, I'm going to put it that way, that China has in Africa, it still persists, that China is an exploitative force on the continent. What do you say to that? Perhaps there were problems before, but it has kind of changed and evolved now over time, has it not?
Well, Andrew, I doubt that over 40 heads of state would be personally present in China if they saw that the relationship as toxic. China has been and continues to be a very important part of African development. So there's a narrative that's put out a lot by the CIA. Remember, they have a huge budget for disinformation. And the narrative is that China is exploiting it. Africa, that there is some sort of debt trap diplomacy. But if you look at the actual numbers, China is at 12% of the combined debt of Africa. The rest is held by mostly the West, and a lot of it by private enterprises. And they're almost doubled rate. China's around 2.7, and the private debt is at 5.0. So you tell me, who is being exploitive here? Is it China with low-cost loans to help development, or high-cost loans that are coming from the private side?
Okay, Adetunji, why don't you answer that? You tell us.
It's, first of all, for me, I look at these, the optics for me doesn't make a lot of sense. Over 50 African heads of states or representatives traveling, some of them, in fact, many of them from countries that are very poor, going to visit one man. Yes, China has very big, resources, but the fact that they have to travel to China at the same time, it already shows that it's a skewed relationship. It's almost like cap in hand, running to China to go and beg the master to say, please save us, we're dying of debt. Our countries are not really growing. I mean, if you look at the debt owed to China by African nations, almost $80 billion of debt. And most of these countries can't even afford to pay salaries, can't even afford to feed their citizens. As you can see with the protests in Kenya, also in Nigeria recently, there was wide-scale protest. So my view is that this one-way relationship ought to be reversed very quickly. And if I have to quote President Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, in his bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping, he said that they need to reverse the trade deficit, and also they need to restructure the relationship. So the question I ask, because I'm fortunate to be sitting on the BRICS Manufacturing Working Group in South Africa, which African products that are finished goods can you find in shops in China? The answer is none. So we got to really look at this situation. I think it's unfortunate. I think they could have done this meeting via online on Zoom if they're serious about change, especially in terms of the cost to many of these countries. And many of these countries also, I suspect the reason why they go to China is because there are no conditions that, for example, the West will ask for democracy, rule of law, upholding human rights. And China is not known for human rights, a good human rights record. And they tend to also, the deals that they sign with these African nations are opaque. And if you look at the Entebbe airport, for example, 20-year loan, and all the revenue has to go back to China. So I'm afraid it's not yet Uhuru. I think it's a one-way relationship. China stands to benefit. the African countries are going to be mired in more debt. Yes, there are more debts to the West, but the conditions are different. China doesn't ask questions.
So
You just
Adetunji,
give the money and tie them up.
is that to say that you think, China's relationship then with African leaders in that sense? Because Einar has said that the relationship is strong, and it's shown at this conference that all of these leaders have come to attend. The top powers of all the African countries are there now in Beijing, that China's relationship with those leaders actually empowers and enriches the people at the top while disempowering the population itself?
Well, all you need to do is just check 20 years of China-Africa relations, and Africa is still worse off despite all the investment. Yes, there's been infrastructural developments in Africa, but when you look at the debt profile of these countries, they're worse off. Why are they protesting Kenya? Kenya is owing China about $6 billion, and they're going there for more money. It doesn't make any sense. Unless they're giving them the money without conditions, there is no value in these relationships. It's a one-way street. It's going to be more pain for Africa because they got to pay the money back. Yes, I know it's a good PR exercise for China in their quest to be able to dominate the South, but there is no value in going 50 people, leaders of sovereign nations, going to beg for more money, especially when they take that money and pocket most of the money. So there is no value.
Okay.
It's just a one-way relationship.
Andrew,
Unless
I mean,
Yeah, okay, let
me
me just let Einar respond quickly. Aly-Khan, I will come to you, but Einar, go ahead.
I believe Aly-Khan believes that the Africans aren't in control of their own countries. And this is definitely a narrative that's left over from colonial times, this idea that somehow the West should be making policies and telling Africans what to do. I think we're long past that, this kind of victim narrative that somehow Africa has been well done by over the last 500 years of colonial occupation, and taking of African resources is nonsense. China is trying to reverse the trade deficit by empowering African countries with the kind of machinery that they can use to process goods so that they can create jobs and create more value at home. Has that been done by Europe or the United States? No. China is also working on joint ventures for research and development so that they're sharing technology. They did this when they had the pandemic. They actually put factories that could produce this what was needed in terms of antiviral around the world, sharing it. That did not happen in the West. So this idea that clinging to the West is somehow going to solve Africa's problems, I think that's passe.
Okay, let me ask Aly-Khan Satchu, because Adetunji describes this as a very skewed relationship. Perhaps it is, but what's the alternative? Is it at the very least better than nothing because at least investment of a sort is coming in, even if it's not trickling down?
That's absolute first point. Given Africa, the continent, African optionality at the time previous gaining, you just had options like IMF, World Bank, and in the last 2 decades, China give African leaders more options. To assume that African leaders have zero agency, I think is false. They absolutely have agency. So what they do with the money that they borrow is critical, and they are agents in that regard. The fact that they have been irresponsible, have borrowed huge amounts of money in the last 2 decades, have misspent that money not only in some cases of borrowing from China, but in many cases borrowings from the IMF, the World Bank, Eurobond issues. That is not to be blamed on China. That is to be blamed on African leadership who have not managed their balance sheet, have not managed their borrowings effectively. So therefore, this is the single most consequential conference that's held, I think, for the African continent. What African leaders do and how they align themselves and put forward a plan which is credible and is going to increase the well-being of African citizens is down to African leaders. I think it's very childish to sort of criticize the Chinese. The Chinese are looking after the national interest. African leaders have got to look after their national interests. Overall, China has been an incredibly positive influence on the continent. They've built roads, they've built railways, they've built ports, they've built the fundamental infrastructure that the continent needs. The fact that in some cases this borrowing has been misspent, I think, is not the fault of the Chinese. It is the fault of our leadership, who have not held themselves to the right standards and have misspent those funds. The fact that all these African leaders are traipsing to Beijing is because China remains a very serious option if you're looking to accelerate growth on the continent. With regard to beneficiation, which I think was an argument that's made, we've also got to put forward credible industrialization strategies which can help our continent develop. You know, we've got all the critical minerals that the world needs for the next century. We need to build the factories and create jobs that make that worthwhile.
Okay, Adetunji, so Aly-Khan is saying it is not on China, it is on African leaders for not allowing the value chain to trickle down to the actual population and misspending what's been invested. Do you agree there?
I totally disagree. Is China open for business with Africa? What we have to test it. The taste of the pudding is in the eating. Is the Chinese market open for African goods? The answer is no. Yes, we appreciate the loans. Yes, we appreciate the infrastructure, because without it, it's difficult for Africa to be able to grow. But the fact is there are no finished African products entering the Chinese market. 1 billion people, there are no African products on Chinese shelves. Until that happens, the relationship is skewed in China's favor. China is actually not doing Africa a favor. What they want to do, of course, is to also leverage the fact that they're a very rich country and they want to compete with the United States. And that's also fine. But the reality is that African leaders need to be wary of these loans because they can't even afford to pay it back anyway. And despite all of this infrastructure and loans, we still see Africans running away. So it means that the Chinese loans are cosmetic, because if they're fundamental, in fact, the Chinese should tie conditions to it so that these leaders, that's why they're saying there's a debt trap diplomacy. Chinese loans have not really changed the fortunes of Africa. We're deeper in debt and we're not making serious progress. You cannot eat infrastructure. People can't even afford to buy food.
Okay.
In Nigeria, for example, there's $170 billion of debt. People are dying of hunger in Nigeria. Where are the Chinese saving those hungry people?
And I think Aly-Khan would ask again, or would argue again, that this is because of the local leadership, not because of the Chinese investment itself. But Aly-Khan, let me ask you then, why isn't China importing African, I guess, products? Where is that coming from, this trade imbalance that it's always Chinese exports going to Africa, but nothing going from Africa to China?
So the trade imbalance is created by the fact that China imports a great deal of crude oil and other minerals and does not refine them necessarily on the continent. That's something that needs to be done. But I think when you talk about African exports on Chinese shelves, there's been a deliberate attempt to increase that throughput. The last FOCAC was focused primarily on agriculture. There was a desire to see more African agricultural products on Chinese shelves. For example, in Kenya is exporting a huge number of avocados into the Chinese market very successfully. With respect to food security, which your previous speaker was talking about, it's not for the Chinese to go and farm our land. It's for us to farm our land. It is our food policies which have created scenarios where we can't feed our own people. It's not to be pinned at the Chinese door. It's to be pinned at our door. I mean, the first thing of any political leadership is feed your people. You can't go and pin it on the Chinese or pin it on the Americans. You could say the same thing about other parts of the world. The Americans dump a whole lot of cheap USAID food on these markets, and therefore it's never sustainable because the local farmer doesn't get paid fairly. So I think it's very easy to pin all the blame on the Chinese, but why? They're not to blame. If you can't feed your people, blame yourself and deal with it.
Let me ask Einar, though, because we know China is very proud of its non-interference policy when it invests and does business with any foreign country, for that matter. So can China actually help local populations if it is not supposed to interfere with any local policy while it pours money into various countries? Can it have it both ways?
Yes, it can. I mean, China went through a lesson period. They initially were doing government-to-government loans, large sums of money, not only in Africa, but also in South America and other places, were flowing to the government. The government would lend money to another government, and they would do with it as they pleased. And China would not comment. They would say, well, this is for resources, and here's the payment way we expect to be paid. But since the advent of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China has been taking a more project-oriented basis. They look at projects in terms of, is there a return? Is this feasible? And it's a lot easier to lend money that way, because then you know that the project, independent of any kind of political change, will be paid back. Now, how did they learn this lesson? Because when they lent to one country, whenever that party was thrown out of office, the only thing you were absolutely certain of is the opposition, or whoever was coming in, would claim that China had participated in enriching these people, that it was China's fault that the money was not spent in the way that they would spend it or was misspent. So China has learned its lesson. It is doing, as I said, more loans based on feasibility of projects.
Okay, Adetunji, I guess you still disagree, but as per the same question I put to Aly-Khan, what is the better alternative? Because really, if every other foreign power has at some point invested in Africa, Einar was very much explaining why he thinks none of the imperial models benefited the African people at all. They were completely exploitative. Going forward, does China at least have a chance? And remember that they're also trying to teach South Africa in particular the model of development that enriched many Chinese people, that alleviated the most severe poverty. Would that help other African countries as well? Is that how they could perhaps share in the wealth and a stronger, more beneficial relationship?
Yeah, I think that would help, but I think the first thing that I want to talk about, the African brands that are not visible in China. Let me give you a practical example. In Nigeria, there's a brand of cars called Innocent Motors, or a company. Innocent, they make cars in Nigeria. And in Ghana, there's Katanka Cars. Now, also in South Africa, there are many South African brands that, South Africa is quite developed in relation to other sub-Saharan countries. We would like, from this FOCAC summit, to see agreements being signed by Chinese companies to import, or the Chinese government, even if it's cosmetic, to import cars from Ghana, to import those cars from Nigeria, to get some products, whether it's wine from South Africa. China does not grow wine. We want to see lots of wine, South African wines, entering the Chinese market. Well, I didn't interrupt you, but anyway. So what I'm saying is it is important for China to begin to import on a massive scale. They've got the budget. They've got the money. It's a confidence booster for Africans to be able to say the Chinese are buying products from us because we are buying products from China anyway. It shouldn't just be about giving us money. It should be about trade, not aid or loans. And that's why I disagree with the two gentlemen. Yes, they've helped us, but now we want to change the conversation to trade. We don't want the aid. We don't want the loans. We can't afford to pay it back. Buy the products that we make in Africa. And there are many products that are made in Africa. And that's what we will tell President Jinping, that please bring out your check and order thousands and thousands of different products from these nations. And that's what the African leaders must ask for, not more money. Because if we are not trading with China, it means we're stupid. Over 1 billion people in China. We need to get into that market.
Okay, I need to give Aly-Khan some thoughts here. I mean, does that make sense? Is there some kind of symmetry here that, you know, China could import African-made cars, for example?
Well, there's absolutely some symmetry, and I think, you know, it is incumbent upon African exporters to look at the opportunities that the Chinese market presents to themselves. With respect to South African wine, you will recall there was a trade spat between Australia and China at one point, and there was a huge importation of South African wine. And I think South African wine definitely, as far as I'm aware, has entered the Chinese market and very, very effectively. Similarly, with South African farm produce, I think China is a pretty big market for that as well. So I think, you know, we got to stop wringing our hands. We got to come up with a plan, just like the previous guest said. We got to say, look, you know, we got these cars. Cars will be tough because the Chinese car manufacturing sector is going great guns and has put other people under tremendous pressure already.
Yeah.
But I think we've just got to organize ourselves better. We've got to stop wringing our hands.
Okay.
And we've got to say, look, this is what we want to do.
Aly-Khan Satchu, that will have to be the final word. Einar, I'm sorry I couldn't get back to you, but we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.